I don't like to be still. Plus I'm very short, so it's okay. Everybody tune to English or Spanish, that's your choices. So, it's great to be in Genoa. Mr. Ferrando said, why Genoa? I think it's very good to be in Genoa, especially when there's so many young people here and so many women in here. I do a lot of these things around the world, and typically you only see about 10% between young and women. I think together you're close to 25%, if not 40%. So I think that's a very good statistics for the Italian shipping market. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about this thing called OPA 90. Has anybody heard of OPA 90 before? Show me your hands. OPA 90, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Not too many people. I was afraid of that. Okay, that's because you're young. You weren't born when this happened. So, OPA 90 is the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, and it's a modification of what was called the Clean Water Act in the United States, okay, going back to the 1970s. So, what happened was the guy in the middle made a boo-boo, and he made an error in judgment, and he ran aground up in Alaska, in a very pristine part of the United States, and there was a massive oil spill. As a result of that oil spill, there was reactive legislation, as we saw after the Titanic, and as we can expect after the Giglio incident. So, when this law came out, it came out in 1993. We're in 2013, and the regulatory activity is still ongoing. So, which is something that's very American. The other thing that's very American, I'm going to say we, although I'm more Peruvian than American, we like to do things our own way. Americans like to do things unilaterally, and that's what happened with this particular law. It's a very intricate law. I will give you a quick summary of what that law gave to the shipping sector. You good? For everyone? Okay. So, two basic points, right? Salvage, we know, has been around since the beginning of shipping. Phoenician times, some people say even before that. And nowadays, internationally, we have the International Salvage Convention of 1989, and that's what governs salvage law. In the US, that's a little different. So as I mentioned earlier, OPA 90, the Exxon Valdez, in today's standards, even in those standards, it really wasn't that bad of an incident. But we had major media. I think a lot of damage was done subsequently during the cleanup. Right? And what happened is every contingency plan in the system, this was Exxon, another big operator, their contingency plans failed. The Coast Guard system failed. The Alaska, the terminal where this ship came out of, their systems failed. When they went to look for oil boom that was supposed to be in the warehouse, it was not there. So everything failed in the process, and of course, tanker owners now have to pay for it. As I mentioned, the regulatory timeline has been going for a long, long time. It's still going. That's the reason I'm here. What did OPA 90 bring with it? This is a quick synopsis of 20 years I'm going to give you now. They designated ship owners as what's called the responsible party. When any of your clients trading in U.S. waters get in trouble with the U.S. Coast Guard, they will call them, not the ship owner, not the vessel owner, they will call them the RP, the responsible party, because that's a legal definition. Okay? It established limits of liability, and it required the so-called COFR, the Certificate of Financial Responsibility. Basically, a bond or a guarantee they have to post in favor of the U.S. government for the cleanup costs. Okay? Interesting point in the United States. Federal law does not preempt state law. So the states can do whatever they want, and Mr. Obama cannot do anything about it. okay? And that's what happened. California and Washington State on the US West Coast, which are very green, as we call them in Texas, tree hugging, you know what that means? Abracho. States. Those states have their own parallel regulations, okay? So very, very demanding place to do business. Finally, well, not finally, one before the last one, it increased the penalties, established prison terms for failing to notify, okay? Very aggressive on that side as well. So as soon as you come into US waters with a ship, you're subject to potential criminal liability because of this law. And if you don't notify, you're really in trouble. And Inchcape Shipping, some of you have heard of them, a pretty large vessel agent. They were fined last week by the US Coast Guard $75,000 for failing to notify. Okay? So they're pretty serious about it. Finally, they established and said, okay, well, we better have some better spill contingency plans, okay? Those spill contingency plans are now called vessel response plans, okay? Every ship trading in US waters must carry one of these vessel response plans. Okay. Right, so now we take the last bullet of my last slide, the spill contingency plans, which became vessel response plans, which is the primary reason of why I'm here today. And we'll start dissecting that. Okay? Initially, the vessel response plan requirement was for tank ships only, vessels carrying oil as cargo. Okay? The Coast Guard was not worried about, or the Congress was not worried about container ships, cruise ships, and so on. Focus was on tankers. It took from 1993 until December 31st of 2008 to finally issue the final regulations for tank ships to have these so-called vessel response plans, and it had very specific requirements. Right? The concept is basically, you see that logo, you must have something similar here in Italy. That's the AAA. If you break down in the motorway, in the highway, you call them and they come and tow you to the repair shop. That was the concept. They wanted every ship owner to have, every tanker owner to have a AAA on the plan. Pre-agreed rates, no delays, no calling of the broker, no calling of the underwriter, no haggling, no negotiating. Get on with it and get the ship towed or refloated as soon as possible. Okay? The focus, of course, being pollution prevention. Well, then we had a couple of bad ones that were non-tankers, that were bulk carriers. The new Carissa, 1999, I think by then maybe half of you were born, and the Selandangayu up in Alaska. Both, again, as usual, judgment errors on the crew, and we ended up with pretty massive incidents, which again happened on the West Coast. Had this been in the US Gulf or even the East Coast, it might have been different. It happened on a very sensitive part, political and environmentally aggressive part of the United States. As a result, Congress said, we better bring these non-tanker people also in compliance with the tanker regulations, and after all, they also carry oil, right? So now non-tankers are in the same mix. The Coast Guard reworked their policy. This was their doctrine. This is what every Coast Guard officer in the United States is trained to brainwash, to believe and stand by. And if you look at this, the entire objective of the Vessel Response Plan program is to minimize pollution. It doesn't say anything about cargo, GA, crew safety, on and on. It's about spills and pollution, okay? Because that's what was expected in Congress and by the local municipalities and the local society on the West Coast. All right, so what does the Coast Guard? We know what a salvage incident is, right? That's anything at sea that requires a system that's in peril and requires assistance, and assistance is rendered, that fits the definition of salvage. These incidents, you know, okay, we have this piece of a highway, you see on the lower corner, it's a bridge, fell on top of the vessel. You could maybe argue, well, that's not really a salvage, you know, the ship can still move. Certainly the hull machinery on the right would say that's not salvage, just get on, you know, get a crane and get it cleaned up. We don't need a Lloyd's open form for that. But to the Coast Guard, both of these incidents were salvages in their minds, because they consider them as having the potential of creating oil pollution. So isn't that's kind of backwards, isn't it? If you work for a P&I club, you're all about pollution, hull machinery, your hull machinery, but the Coast Guard is putting these guys in the same mix, right? It's conflict. It's creating an insurance conflict of sorts. Okay. So for the past 15 years in the States, we as salvors, as responders in the United States, we've been dealing with a very unique framework, much different than other places. We have a severe criminal liability exposure. There's been a few cases where salvors have been found negligent in causing damage to coral reefs, and the law could apply to us just as strictly as it could to a ship owner. It's a pollution-driven system. Before we were, if we had a ship aground and we said, well, we need to lighter the ship, we could consider, well, we may have to dump 5,000 tons of crude over the side and save 100,000, right? Makes sense. Well, nowadays, I don't think we could even think about that. Inexperienced regulators, the U.S. Coast Guard, nice people, nice guys, well-trained, well-educated. Unfortunately, they really don't have experience in shipping, in the maritime merchant shipping, but they have all the power. And now they're carrying guns to chase drug dealers and terrorists. So it's not a good mix. And they have a very regimented system of handling responses, and I'll show you a couple of pictures. They treat it as a military operation when there is a ship casualty. In my days, when I was out on ships doing salvage, it only took 3 or 4 guys, a casualty surveyor, the owner's rep, the captain, that was it. And those days you had telex. Half of you don't know what telex is. Now we have all this fancy technology, and you have a room like it's at the bottom. On an average size job, you can have a room with as many people as are here today, managing a grounding, managing a small fire. That's what the system requires. And so this system becomes sort of a monster, and it needs to be fed information. Okay, that's the reality in the United States. This is the command center of the Kuluk incident. This is the Shell oil drill rig, drill platform or vessel that ran aground up in Alaska recently. That's how many. That was a relatively simple, straightforward refloating operation. That's how many people you had in the command center. Again, it was driven by politics. So, the blender. I call Open 90 the blender. How do you say blender in licuadora? No, how do you say blender in Italian? Frullatore. Open 90 did forget about the relationship between hull and P&I, an important relationship, because ultimately what the Coast Guard wants is money to flow, contractors to get hired and move so the response happens. But they created this conflict that may force a P&I correspondent to go out there quickly and start spending money that really belongs to hull and the rider. And then the partner is going to be submitting his claim and say, wait a second, I didn't approve that, that should be part of that. Throw it, see if you can squeeze it through GA and see what happens. Okay? Definitely forget about cargo. Of course, we know why. Because who owns the cargo of the tankers? Exxon, BP, all the big boys. who have a very powerful lobby in Congress. Salvage wreck removal, general average, charter parties, all those relationships, the law never took into account. It never gave Intertanko and other people a voice, a chance to, back in the 90s, to give their position. So if you're trading in the US or your clients are trading in the US, it's important, really important that they understand a little bit of the system, or they at least are aware of what could happen. And they need to understand it because there's no choice. It's like going to a foreign country, you gotta try to understand the culture, the language, and the customs, okay? Right, how are we doing on time? Good?
Yeah.
Okay, you start. Okay. All right, the vessel response plan, okay? This is the document that every ship that calls US must have on board. If you don't have a vessel response plan on board, you don't go in. Or they'll let you in, but then they give you what's called alternative compliance criteria, measures. And they may say, well, you need to hire 5 tugs, 6 tugs, do this, do that, which of course the charter is not going to pay. So the ship owner who's struggling to make money is going to be in the red. 5 things that have to be included in this vessel response plan. Okay, now we're going to really start focusing on the things that Mr. Cameron mentioned. You need what's called a qualified individual. Okay, that is not something we provide. This is a separate service. Qualified individual is somebody that represents the company in the US, speaks English, and has the ship owner's authority to spend money. It's somebody that the US government can go to and touch. Okay? You need to have a pre-contracted spill management team. The spill management team doesn't go to clean the spill. They go into that big room that you saw to manage and feed the monster. The oil spill removal organization, 4 words to really say cleanup company. Is this a company that goes out with the oil booms on the beach to clean up, right? You then have to have a rapid assessment service. This is a technical company, usually a class society of the vessel, that would do damage stability, structural analysis of the condition of the vessel during a casualty. Again, that has to be pre-contracted, so there's no delay. And finally, you now have to pre-contract a salvage company, which goes totally against the principles of salvage, the way salvage has been done since day one, which should be a voluntary service when there is property in peril, okay? So these are the 4 things under the red circle. You actually have to enter into a contract that specifies tariffs, that outlines liabilities, that outlines what you're going to provide and what the owner is going to provide. And you have to enter this in your vessel response plan before you come into U.S. waters. All right? So, interesting. You know, if I was the charter of the vessel, I was the cargo owner, they have no clue. But in a way, you're sort of pre-binding those interests. I'm not a maritime lawyer, but technically that's sort of what's happening. The ship owner has to certify that the company they select, currently in the market there are 5 companies providing this service in the United States, this salvage service. They have to certify that the company is adequate. Okay, puts a lot of burden on the owner. They have to prepare a fire plan, and they have to do exercises, drills and exercises. Okay, so very detailed system. These are 15 criteria points that the owner can use to select a company. Because many owners say, well, how am I going to know who to hire? You, Coast Guard, should tell me who is approved and I'll pick them. Well, the Coast Guard said, no, the law is clear. The liability is on you, the burden is on you, you pick it. And then it got even crazier. The Coast Guard then said, now that you're qualified or certified or whatever you are, you now have to try to perform these services in these time frames. So we needed to develop a system to be able to meet these response timelines around the United States all the way from Guam, which is way out in the Pacific, past Hawaii, all the way to Puerto Rico, all the way up to the Great Lakes. Okay, so they created a very defined timelines for response in the U.S. and for firefighting. That's another funny thing. You know, they broke up salvage and firefighting. You know, fighting a fire on a ship is salvage. We couldn't get the Coast Guard to understand it. This is what we had to do. These are all the areas where we have pre-positioned equipment. We had to invest in equipment and pre-position it around the country, just like some of our competitors did. So a lot of money has gone into it. Of course, that's a good thing now because there's quite a substantial infrastructure around the United States. So that's been beneficial. The problem is there's no casualties happening. Okay, I'll skip that. So this whole system, you know, the way we have looked at it is really, we have to use and learn the system to manage risk, our own risk and the risk of our clients, and ultimately manage expectations. You know, we have YouTube, Twitter, all these things that are pretty much automatic when anything happens. And the effect of those can have on the public and on the authorities and all the way down to us and the masters on board the ships is horrendous. And we've seen it. We've seen it in the States. So we really have to jump fast and try to tackle the tiger before the tiger eats us. I'll skip through this. That's it. Compliance recommendations. Okay, this is really aimed at the ship owning side. You need to audit the SMFF companies, the salvage companies. So if you're an owner, you cannot just go and say, well, let me look in the website, or I've heard this name, or who do you recommend, Charlie? You really need to do some due diligence and document it. You document it because you really, if something were to happen or go wrong in a response, you might be scrutinized. You have a lot of documentation to collect, but the most important thing is you really got to review the contract and the funding agreement you're going to enter or pre-enter into. Not just because it's accepted by the International Group of P&I Clubs means it's an acceptable salvage contract for your hull and machinery lead underwriter, right? So you need to discuss it with your marine insurers. And it's something that ship owners should not wait. They shouldn't wait. We know that the Nordic market is very well advanced on it. I know the Greek market is definitely going to wait. So let's hope the Thai market doesn't. Operational recommendations in the US. And this is perhaps something that could apply to other parts of the world. And I've been on both sides of the fence. I believe that nowadays the crew that goes on the ships is a lot different than the crew that used to go on the ships 30 years ago. It used to be their ship. They would spend months with the same crew. They were part of the family. It's changed now. Ship owners now grab crew from here, from this agency, from that agency. This guy's from the Philippines, this guy from Croatia, this guy's from Peru. They eat different, they pray different, they sleep different. Huge factors which affect the operational safety of the vessel. Well, what do you think happens when there's a casualty? It gets worse. So the crew needs to be aware, and imagine these guys down in front of the Coast Guard with guns when they have an incident. They really, really need to be aware of what could happen in the US. Overreact to all situations. Don't think it's a light grounding. Assume it's a bad incident. You can always pull back. It's a lot cheaper to say, hey, Mauricio, send those 3 pumps back. We'll just keep 1. Than to say, you know what, we're behind the 8 ball now, we need 4 more, right? Notification. Many captains rely heavily on the charters for their initial notification. Big mistake. The charter doesn't care. He's just worried about your ship coming in to load and when he's going to put you afire. You need to call the office and activate your internal systems, okay? And bring professionals to assess the casualties. If you're having chest pains or your friends having chest pains, you don't try to diagnose it yourself, right? You call 112? Is that the number? Or 911? 118, sorry. Okay. In the US it's 911. And then you bring a professional that can assess the patient. Same thing. I'm down to the last slide now. So what I'll leave you with, because all of you I believe belong in the blue and the light green circle, is that this sort of what I call best management practice is what really needs to be emphasized in the US and I think in other areas, like the piracy areas. The relationship between the ship owner, the insurers, and the responders needs to be strengthened. The salvage guy in the US is a guy that you want to get to know now. It's not the guy that you start, no, I don't want to see you again. Open. So you really need to know them now, know how they operate, know what they can bring to the table, feel comfortable, make sure your insurers are comfortable, and then make them part of your team. Ok, grazie mille. Come visit Peru.